Let's get going. This session is looking at Europe's place in the world. There's too much catastrophizing going on in the world these days, but Europe, the world in which we find ourselves, is a bad one. Our strategic predicament is dire. In the 30 years after 1989, we had an imperfect multilateral order which functioned pretty well. That's over. The world we live in now has two superpowers. They're both predators. And of the middle powers, we're unlucky enough in Europe to have the most warlike and aggressive on our borders. So it's not a pretty picture. So to discuss this with us today, we have Barry Andrews MEP. Could I just make a personal acknowledgement? Barry was the DG here a few years ago. He was a fantastic DG and a great team player. And we'll have a new DG announced in the coming days. If that person is half Barry's caliber, we'll be flying. Katy Hayward is Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast. Ilke Toygür is Director, Global Policy Centre and Professor of Practice of European Politics at IIEA University. And joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Tom Wright, the Global Policy Centre and Professor of Practice. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong one there. We have Tom Wright, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and of course, he's spent a number of years in the White House serving the Biden administration. So maybe, Tom, as you're at slight disadvantage to be online, but you also have a perspective from outside Europe, as well as being a European by birth. Will you maybe kick us off? And can I just say, I'd ask you all just to keep your remarks to 5, maximum 6 minutes. As my 5-year-old knows, I'm a strict discipline.
So Dan, can you hear me okay there?
Loud and clear, Tom.
Great. Sorry, you just broke up for 1 second just as you were turning to me, but it's great to be with everyone. I wish I could be there in person. And I guess, looking at it from here, obviously there's a lot of drama going on each day, and we're all sort of obsessing over the Iran war. But I think taking a step back is important, just to look at what the state of the international order is. And to me, I think the order that we have relied on since the end of the Cold War has essentially, unraveled. It was under different stresses and strains for some time. We had the rise of China, the international financial crisis, Russia's action against Ukraine in 2013-14, COVID, Brexit, Trump. It somehow sort of survived all of those, but I think it has basically snapped because of the actions of 3 leaders. I think the one we pay maybe less attention to sometimes is Xi Jinping in China, where I think what he has done, and it really is his decision, I think, on the trading side, is from the Made in China 2025 project, which started about 11 years ago. I think it's fundamentally broken the international trading system and has given countries basically a choice between protectionism and deindustrialization. And I think we're seeing that become very acute in Europe's relations with China, this month. And I know there'll be some movement there in the coming week. So that's sort of the first pillar. The second is Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and essentially reintroducing this, era of sort of major war in Europe. We've seen that go on now for longer than World War I, and longer than Russia's war against Nazi Germany in World War II, and with no sort of end in sight. But I think that has fundamentally transformed, as you mentioned, the security environment regionally, but also globally. I mean, it's really pulled in other countries, China, North Korea, Iran, as well as, of course, the US originally supporting Ukraine. And then the final part, I think, is Donald Trump. And I think what he has done, particularly on the alliance side, viewing America's core alliances as sort of targets to extract something from, rather than a permanent ally and a strategic sort of partner, and have that community of like-minded nations, I think is transformative. And that was most dramatically illustrated with the Greenland episode earlier this year, which hasn't fully gone away and could come back. And so I think that is sort of the world we are in, is that old order, I think, has essentially dissolved, which is not to say that every aspect of it is gone. There are still remnants there. I think the alliances are still there. Europe and US allies in Asia, I think, are keen to keep the alliances afloat, partly because the external environment is so daunting and because they're quite concerned about going on their own. But as they look forward, I think even if there is a change in administration here in 2029, I think they will know that there are at least sort of two Americas going forward. There might be the internationalist America that they're more comfortable dealing with, but that America First America and Trump term 2, could always come back in the future. He's now won twice, so I think that is a relatively semi-permanent fixture of US politics, and we might have a pretty dramatic fluctuation in US strategy. So I think the key question for the EU and for NATO is how to sort of mitigate that fluctuation and how to deal with that new world. And I think that starts with building one's own strength and having a much more sort of coordinated and coherent European foreign policy, and then to work more closely with like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere to sort of build. I don't really believe in what Mark Carney was saying about middle powers. I'm not sure that's viable, but there's something sort of to it in trying to have coalitions of like-minded countries. I think the challenge, as we saw in the UK yesterday, is that that's one thing to lay out in theory. It's a very different thing to execute in practice. And so, governments have real fiscal constraints, real political challenges. And so it's going to be quite difficult to have that increase in defense spending and a more closely coordinated foreign policy. But I think that is the task that governments have. I'll stop there. Thank you.
1 second, Tom. Perfect. Thank you. Ilke, we'll come this way, maybe.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. Actually, I was going to also start with the state of transatlantic relations, because I think it explains a lot why the EU is doing what it is doing at this moment in time. And for me, the key point there is that the difference between Trump 1 administration and the Trump 2 administration. Because if we look at the Trump 1 administration, with that experience, Europeans were ready to face more America First trade. That was already there. Undermining of multilateral alliances, starting with, of course, NATO, and not necessarily that, from WHO to Paris Climate Agreement. This approach to multilateralism was already experienced in the Trump first administration. And thirdly, actually connecting to the NATO question, Europeans were already aware that they need to take more responsibility for their own security. What is really different in Trump 2, and I think it is one of the main underlying reasons of Europe's approach to the world right now, is twofold. First of all, the Europeans didn't expect Americans directly underline European integration projects, not only supporting far-right political parties in the member states, but also undermining the projects, calling it in a civilizational decline, economic decline, technological decline, etc., etc. So this has become a direct attack to the project itself. And secondly, of course, nothing might be the same after Greenland this year, where the Europeans also saw that their most important and most significant ally can actually also potentially attack their territorial sovereignty. So I think the understanding the differences between Trump 1 and Trump 2 explains a lot what the EU is doing today. This brings me to my second point. We are clearly seeing a charm offensive in trade agreements, and we have seen agreements waiting for decades moving forward very fast. Mercosur, Mexico, Indonesia, Australia, you name it, it is out there. But this time, trade agreements are also complemented with two different tracks. The first one is security and defense partnerships. The EU itself signed 12 different security and defense partnerships since 2024, with a very big variety of countries that include some countries in the Balkans, but also UK, of course, Canada, Australia. Ghana is the last state that the EU has signed security and defense partnerships with. So this is this new flexible instrument that the EU has introduced. And maybe less important, but I still want to underline that, the use of Horizon Europe program. It was always a tool. It was. It's not the first time that the EU is including third countries or to Horizon Europe. But what we are seeing also an intention to create joint research networks for innovation, especially in the tech domain, but not just limited to. So we are seeing a more extensive partnership portfolio from the EU's point of view. And my third and last point, because I have like 1 minute and a half left, this is very stressful. Now it's like EU and the world, the entire world, and you have 5 minutes, is the introduction of the concept of flexibility. Of course, we have seen all kinds of intergovernmental partnerships also in the past. This is not just now, but we are seeing an active use of, first of all, coalitions of the willing. In the case of Ukraine, we have seen a very important partnership with the participation of the United Kingdom, but not only limited to, for providing security and defense. But we have also seen a European political community established as a pan-European framework stage where the leaders can talk to each other. But we are also seeing now different intentions of creating coalitions for provision of energy and connectivity. And the last two, of course, requires long-term planning and investment, most of all. But what we are seeing in the European continent right now, that there is a very flexible and dynamic conversation going on, not just for providing security and prosperity to the European Union and its citizens, but also involving other non-EU European member states. Of course, I'm very happy to come to the question of the United Kingdom in the second round, because this is one of the most important examples. But of course, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland are also partners in crime. So the United States changed it all. We have different and a more holistic approach to partnerships right now. And thirdly, flexibility is at the heart of it.
Great. Thanks so much for that. That really interesting point about the 12 security and defense partnerships. We maybe definitely go into that a little bit later. Katy, would you like to go next, or would you prefer to go after Barry?
I'll go after Barry.
Go Barry.
Thank you, Katy. So thanks, Dan, and thank you very much for the invitation to be back here in the IIEA. It's just such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and my predecessor, Tom Arnold, who was the Director General before me, and great to see you here as well, Tom. So what I'm going to start from is President von der Leyen's speech at the EU Ambassadors Conference in March, which garnered a lot of headlines. And the particular line that really struck people as quite striking was where she said, Europe should no longer be the custodian for the old world order, for a world that has gone and will not return. And she got a lot of criticism for that, because it made people think that maybe Europe was abandoning the rules-based order. But her next sentence was, we will not abandon the rules-based order. So, but she did go on to say that whether our institutions and decision-making is more a help or a hindrance to our credibility as a geopolitical actor is a question that we have to take seriously. So she put in issue the institutions, which is the External Action Service, let's be clear, and the decision-making process, which is QMV, unanimity, obviously. But so both of those issues are actually very live and are really being pursued at the moment. The other aspect of credibility as a geopolitical actor is this idea of dual objective. No longer do we, in my area of international development, no longer do we simply decide that a central binding logic of our development policy is the eradication of poverty. Now we are looking at this in terms of how this can serve Europe's interests. So to quote specifically, we're currently dealing with the multi-annual financial framework for 2028 to 2034. And the external part of that is 10% of the budget. So that's 200 billion euro. So the legal framework for that is the Global Europe Instrument. So we're discussing and negotiating the Global Europe Instrument. And Article 5 says that the objective is to foster partnership that contributes simultaneously to the sustainable development of partner countries and to the strategic interests of the Union. So these are two things that are pulling sometimes in different directions. So to give an example of this, if we are as a union seeking critical raw materials from some part of Africa, are we at the same time going to simultaneously pursue human rights interests, for example? Equally, if we're going to be, if we want a returns agreement with a third country, are we going to insist on human rights standards? Technically, we will, but it's a clear tension that's contained. Just to give this a concrete example, and this is a typical issue that we're dealing with in negotiations. So human rights in the current framework, in the current legal framework, requires a minimum expenditure of 15% of what's called NDICI. That will be non-binding in the proposed Global Europe Instrument from 2028. Human rights was mentioned in the substantial articles of NDICI, and it is now part of the recitals. So this sends out a very clear message to our delegations across the world. The EU delegations who prepare the multi-annual investment partnerships for each country, that we are downgrading human rights and we are placing at a much higher emphasis issues such as critical raw materials, returns, and all of these other issues, which are very legitimate. But we just need to be clear about what all of this means. One final point I'll make, because there are other issues we'll come back to in the conversation, is about Ireland's presidency. So we announced this during the week. It's going to be competitiveness, it's going to be values, it's going to be security. The values means internally rule of law, and it means how we finance the external action side. And the problem we're going to see is that 200 billion I referred to, and the Cypriots this week already announced their proposal, which cuts it by 37 billion. But the common agricultural policy has a 140 billion euro shortfall. So if you're a politician in the council at the close of these negotiations, you have a choice between supporting your farmers or human rights in distant parts of the world. The politics is very, very simple and very, very clear. So not only are we creating a legal framework that substantially downgrades these values, but we are also probably going to see a dramatic cannibalizing of that proposed budget towards the end of the negotiations. So that's pressure for Ireland to deliver on values, to put a budgetary background to that strategic priority that they set. So
thanks, Barry. I think that issue of interest versus values, maybe we'll come back to that in a little while. Katy, over to you.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad I said that I go after you, Barry, because there actually is some similarity between what we're going to say. So in the briefing for this, we're asked as contributors to address the topic from the perspective of our own expertise and experience. So that is definitely what I'm going to do. My expertise being in relation to the UK-EU relationship and Brexit, and my experience being very particularly from Northern Ireland. And just, we've had the worst few days that I can remember in Northern Ireland for a very long time. And just to give a little illustration, walking to the train station this morning, I actually ended up having to run because they still had Botanic Gardens closed. They've been closing the parks early and not opening them early either. But going through the streets, a number of the houses near where I live, which is quite a studenty area, have posters that people have put up in their windows saying students live here. And that's because the addresses of those accommodations had been listed as targets. We live in a very diverse area. So the absolute fear that is present in Northern Ireland at the moment is very stark. I'm conscious that this 2 days after the Irish presidency, priorities were announced, and as Barry's already mentioned, one of those is values, and the way that this is summarised by the Irish government is, our union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. Non-coincidentally, these are also the values on which the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is founded and on which peace in Northern Ireland depends. This is why the violence in Northern Ireland has been quite so disturbing and upsetting, because it represents the absence of these values. My point that I want to make, if you bear with me on this, is that Northern Ireland isn't a bizarre place apart with its own internal demons. What is happening this week shows actually how profoundly connected it is to challenges and forces that are active in Europe. A point I like to make is that we shouldn't understand Northern Ireland in terms of unionism and nationalism, but actually the presence of hard right ideology. And this is a Europe-wide and beyond, obviously, phenomenon. So hard right ideology, strong nationalism, opposition to multilateral and supranational agreements, emphasis on sovereignty. Secondly, anti-liberalism, criticism of elites, opposition to multiculturalism, minority rights, anti-immigration sentiment, support for deportations and strong border controls, and cultural conservatism, anti-LGBT rights, women's rights, etc. 20 or even 10 years ago, these were marginal ideologies in Europe. Today, many countries have these ideologies represented in parties that are the largest, enjoy the largest portion of support or the second largest portion of support, including, of course, Italy, where the government is having a hard right, represented by a hard right party, France, Germany, Austria, Poland, and in Hungary, even though we had good news, Fidesz still had 37% of the vote. Even where parties are smaller in Europe than enjoying the largest portion of support, they are still influential in governments in a number of countries, including Slovakia and Finland. The primary influence of these ideologies comes through shaping discourses and priorities. Today, we see the European Migration and Asylum Pact come into effect. This is intended, I think, to bring rigor and fairness to an issue that causes division within and between member states. However, as we know, according to the debates, it risks breaching human rights and international law. To summarize, border detention, including of children, risks breaching the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, fast-track procedures, risks non-refoulement, and the right to a fair hearing, crisis derogations, invoke arbitrary detention, externalization deals, risks breaching obligations under the Refugee Convention, and limited procedural safeguards, risks avoiding the right to effective remedy. Another piece of legislation I want to mention is in the UK. This is the European Partnership Bill, which again is intended for good purposes, i.e. to enable the UK to have its agreements with the EU, to enable the UK, if you like, don't quote me on this, to be a rule taker, to enable that dynamic alignment that will bring the closer UK-EU relationship. However, this is using Henry VIII powers. It will give extraordinary powers to government in order to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. Both these measures are purportedly done with good intentions and purpose, to enable the core values to be upheld against anti-democratic forces. But let's imagine just for a moment those Henry VIII powers put in the hands of a Reform UK minister, Nigel Farage. Imagine the Migration Pact put into enactment in a European Parliament or European Council in which AfD, Rassemblement National, peace are dominant. The dangers are obvious. The risks of not being thoroughly consistent in deed as well as in word when it comes to democratic values are immense and stark.
Okay,
and in that regard, my last line. It's literally my last line. It's my last line. It's my last line. That is the lesson to take from Northern Ireland as well as from our history. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, can I come to you with the first one to pick up on something that you mentioned about the future, and quite pessimistic, as you say, you don't think things will go back to the way they were. But is it not fair to say that the current president is just so utterly unique, there will be never anybody like him again? So let's just consider that J.D. Vance is the next president. How would you envisage that playing out?
Yeah,
from our perspective in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that it looks like that America First position has sort of gained control and will continue to exert control in the Republican Party, right? And so I agree that Donald Trump is unique, and it's very hard to see any future American president sharing some of his, psychological characteristics, should we say. So, for instance, the obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize, it's really hard for me to imagine that J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio would have that as much of a hang-up as he does. Having said that, I think, the idea that tariffs can be used and are a good thing, that the US should be trying to use economic power coercively, that alliances are not America's most valuable strategic asset, and actually, maybe the US should pull back in Europe or even maybe in Asia. Those things, I think, are likely to continue to shape Republican foreign policy. Now, I think there's a little bit of a divergence depending on who it will be that would emerge. And in some ways, Vance is actually more, in some ways, anti-European or anti-NATO than Trump is. I think for Vance, it's more ideological, right? For Trump, it's sort of personal. It's sort of, if he thinks he can call something a win, he has this hang up about alliances, but he's quite prone to flattery, as, European officials like Mark Rutte are trying to capitalize on. Whereas Vance, I think, it is a little bit more ideological. Rubio, on the other hand, possibly would be a little bit of a throwback to an earlier era. He would definitely continue parts of the America First approach, but he does, I think most people think deep down, sort of appreciate the importance of alliances. But I would say that overall, the challenge, especially if a Democrat comes in, will be that the world's very challenging. We need to work much more closely with Europe, but Europe will also know that the US could change back, right? And so how do we work together to build in a hedge there so that plan A is the US and Europe work much more effectively together, but plan B, if the US turns against Europe in the future, that Europe has something to fall back on, can rely on itself, is more independent, is less reliant and less dependent on the US. And can we sort of build that in from the beginning? I think that will be something that we didn't really do in the Biden administration, but I think until maybe mid-2024, but I think it would be necessary in the future.
Ilke, picking up on that, on the defense side of things, what's your view on NATO and particularly the US commitment to NATO? And then if you just tell us a little bit more about those 12, I was not aware of that, 12 in just 24, since 2024. Just give us some more detail about what the content of those.
Yeah. Actually, what Tom says here is extremely important. If there was a world to choose, the Europeans would choose a world where they can collaborate with the United States as they have done so in the past. But I think since Greenland, because last year the policy was still appeasement, and the Europeans assumed that appeasing the president will still lead some kind of damage control and some kind of basic rules in the relationship. I think Greenland created a new understanding of transatlantic relations. At least this is how I see it. And right now, what we are seeing is that NATO is still very significant, and the European defense buildup is still happening under the NATO umbrella. So this is still the modus operandi and the format that the Europeans organize themselves. But there is more and more behind the closed doors conversations about if there is a shock from the US side to NATO, be it in the command structure, be it in stopping sharing intelligence, be it sharing the new technologies for the weapon systems, etc., what could the Europeans do? So what we are seeing right now is a major conversation about Plan B, but behind the closed doors. I'm sure the leaders will give a family photo and pretend that everything is fine in Ankara. But it's still, I think this is the episode where the ones that are closer to their national governments, see these conversations are ongoing as Plan B and maybe A and a half moving forward. The second question about the security and defense partnerships, they are still very flexible, very initial stage, and they are different in character from each other. But I find them very, very significant because we have one with India, another one with Japan, South Korea, Australia.
Do they run in parallel with the bilateral trade deals?
Some of them are yes, some of them are no. But if we look at the list, most of these countries have special relationships with the EU anyway. Norway has an European Economic Area membership, but at the same time also signed a security and defense partnership. This is for industry cooperation, but also different elements of security and defense posture, let's put it that way. This is kind of a preparation for the future. Let's put it that way. But I think it is really important from the European point of view and from the institutional point of view that the EU institutions are getting into also the conversation on security and defense. Think about it. Commission is the institution that is signing these agreements. We can talk more about that, but I find this very interesting.
Okay, good. Katy, there was a discussion yesterday about sort of values and a lot of discussion about Hungary. I was really surprised the Romania case didn't come up. So as people know, the first round of the presidential election in Romania was cancelled on the basis of alleged foreign interference. Now, any election in Europe, in any country, anywhere now, could be cancelled on that basis. How worried are you about that as a precedent?
From Romania, the electoral interference?
Well, the election was cancelled. Does that weaken democracy in Europe generally by sending out a signal that if they did it there, then we can allege foreign interference and cancel our election here?
Most certainly we need to be alert to that risk. And what's bewildering is how slow governments are being. I mean, I know the EU is developing initiatives in this regard, but to try and shore up their electoral processes against such interference, and most particularly, of course, the capacity to influence electoral positions online, digital platforms, and the lack of regulation in that regard. But I think the possibility of claiming interference and for it to be fully investigated is necessary to uphold. We have to sort of decide ourselves what it is that's absolutely crucial and important, what we count as being a fair and democratic election, and then rigorously enforce that for sure.
Okay, so I'll come to questions after the one to Barry. So if people want to indicate whether they...
particular election I would love to have cancelled is the 2011.
Barry, the interests and values thing. So autocracies don't have interests or don't have values. It's pretty much interests. Now, if the realpolitik argument is that if we democracies put our values, we are putting ourselves at an immediate disadvantage when we deal with those countries. And that in this new world of hard power, that when values and interests are traded, Europe needs to think more about itself and its interests and downplay values. What do you make of that argument?
That's very binary, and it's not as simple as that. I mean, then you're China, then you're extracting raw materials, and it's transactional and it's commercial, and there's no strings attached, and we can't compete with China on cost and scale. I mean, we're wasting our time in that regard. If you're going to do international development policy on the basis that they're always going to buy European, or they're going to give the procurement to European companies, or the contract is going to go to a European company, you're adding cost, you're giving much less autonomy, and you're abandoning your commitment to poverty eradication. So we can do that, and all of that is promoted by a lot of people in the European Parliament right now.
In the Parliament,
yeah, absolutely, and I would say almost a majority now, because the fundamental principles of international development are not trending the way they were sort of 10 years ago around the Sustainable Development Goals. That's all completely changed, and you can see it in Ilke mentions around the trade relations. So we can see that there's much. I have to confess that I support a lot less naivety than was the case previously. Of course, we have to change our external approach to third countries. There's no question about it. And you see it in the trade. I was on the trade committee in the last Parliament. So when China was considered The biggest concern, we've developed a huge number of trade defense instruments. And that was really, really important to anti-dumping, anti-coercion, foreign subsidy screening, all the rest. So we did all of that. And now what we're doing, paradoxically, the Trump tariffs have driven a lot of our trade partners into trade agreements. Because while Europe is seen as slow and bureaucratic, in fact, we're now considered as reliable and certain in a very uncertain world. So we've closed a deal with Australia, with Mercosur, with Mexico, with India, of course. I mean, India was one of the hardest, and Mercosur was around for 20 years. Plus, I think Ilke's point is really interesting that we are also doing things like clean trade and investment partnerships that are below the level of requiring the Parliament's consent.
Yeah.
We've lots of memorandums of understanding on critical raw materials that are below the level of requiring Parliament. So as a parliamentarian, I don't love them, but the single point is, look, we have to be less naive. We have to operate in the world that we find. And interestingly, another quote from that March speech that von der Leyen gave to the EU ambassadors was, this is a generational project around European independence. A really interesting phrase. It kind of was lost as people were talking about this other question of, abandoning EU, international law. But yeah, I think it's not as binary as one or the other. We can do both. Otherwise, we end up.
I'll take that point. Look, on great speeches, Mark Carney's either in town or coming into town. Tom, he gave it was certainly a brilliantly constructed speech at Davos earlier in the year. He was making the point that the middle powers need to align. Do you see for Europe that as an option? Does that really strengthen Europe if we have closer relations with the Canadas, the Japans, or is it really not going to make that much difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a difference, and I think Europe, is not, Europe is bigger than that. If you take it as a unit, which of course is, a little bit problematic, but the European Union as a whole, I would say, is not sort of a traditional middle power. It has a lot more economic weight than that. And I think it's incredibly important, for Europe to be working with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia and with others, and Canada, of course, to try to develop trading links, but also politically and diplomatically and to find ways to sort of stabilize the situation that we're in. I didn't love Carney's speech, I have to be honest, because I thought he constructed it as more of I was expecting him, or, was set up to say the emperor has no clothes, Trump is not who people say he is, that he's able to solve all these problems and have these peace deals. And instead he pulled back and blamed the rules-based international order and equated that with communism, which I thought was a little much. So, I thought it was a clever rhetorical device on his part, and it got a lot of plaudits. I didn't love that, though. And I also thought he was sort of writing off, the US and not holding out the prospect that a different US administration obviously could, play a more constructive role, although there will be uncertainty going forward. But I think that, working with like-minded democracies outside of the European area, I think is a critical component of any European strategy.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just one building up on also the question that you have asked to Barry. I think this values versus interests or democracy like-minded conversation is a bit limited in defining the EU's attitude. What is the main role of any government or the European Union as a supranational institution? It is providing prosperity and security to its citizens. So if the world has gone crazy, the EU is going to adapt its instruments and policies and agreements so that it can still fulfill that goal. But this is how I see this. This doesn't mean that undermine the values. This doesn't mean that you stop providing public goods. It doesn't mean that you don't care about democracy, because democracy is a part of the prosperity of European citizens. But this artificial division between, is it the values, is it the interests? No, you have a role. You have a role to play for citizens, and you need to find the instruments to play that role. I think that's, for me, this is how I frame the conversation in my mind. And just maybe one correction that I should do to myself, because HRVP is very much pressured these days. she also plays a very important role in security and defense partnerships. External Action Service plays a very important role in this as well. So we are opening up again this conversation on who would do European foreign policy and how. But I think it is really important to keep this focus on why are we doing what we are doing.
Okay, so there was a report in the FT yesterday about the External Action Service being radically revamped. Maybe somebody would like to put a question around that. Tom, you mentioned Europe's economic weight. One of the reasons, I've become more pessimistic over the past year or so is because I think we in Europe used to believe economically there were three major powers in the world, US, China, and ourselves. When the US put a gun to our head, we caved. We realized that we just we weren't able to go toe to toe with the US. We're now in a situation with China. And on Thursday, our Insights event has 3 great European China experts. Join that if you're interested. But we're at a critical moment now in the China relationship where China is threatening us. If we're not able to stand up to China, then I think we've grossly overestimated our economic weight. Barry, do you have thoughts on from the European Parliament what the view of China is and how these relations are going?
Yeah, well, next week we'll vote on the Turnberry Agreement actually in the Parliament Strasbourg. And, back in August when President von der Leyen went to Trump's golf course in Scotland to cave on 15% tariffs for European goods and zero for the US, everybody felt very humiliated. But as you say, Ukraine was very much in the thinking, and it provided some cover and justification for that situation. But we have now actually, the Parliament has slow walked Turnberry consent, and we've really benefited from that because we've now added various safeguards into to make sure that we'll have a sunset clause in 2029. Plus, there are safeguard clauses around surges, in particular US products into the European market. And I think that really strengthens it. So I think it'll probably attract a lot of support. On the China side, this is all the question of made in Europe and made with Europe. And is this a good cost or a bad cost? Because naturally it is a cost. I read yesterday Jaguar Land Rover saying, look, if you're going to insist on made in Europe, you're just adding our costs.
Yep.
If you're going to do this around energy creation, I mean, people are screaming for reductions in energy prices. And, we're talking about adding cost into the energy mix in the way, whether it's through supply chains, whether it's through solar panels or wind turbines. If we try to cut China, reduce China out of that supply chain, that is going to come at a very, very big cost in circumstances where Draghi identified energy as the crucial part of achieving competitiveness and put a price tag on it, 800 billion euro. So, there's a real tension there going on about China. For the first time 2 weeks ago, a European delegation of parliamentarians went to China. Quite a lot of them went over at the end of May. And it's the first time since they banned the travel ban on certain MEPs. So things are beginning to loosen up, but there's a real debate going on around all that, especially around the Industrial Accelerator Act. So.
As there should be. Good. Can I get some indication of who wants to come in with questions? And as hands go up, Katy, we're just Europe's economic weight. We saw very clearly that the EU has a lot of economic weight relative to a country like even UK, G7 country. You mentioned the prospect of the next UK election. Reform has committed to scrapping the Windsor framework if elected. What happens then? So there's a gentleman here. Do you want to take that, Katy?
What it's worth, I don't think they will, because they don't want to provoke a trade war with the EU. I do think, though, there will be several challenges in the UK-EU relationship if they come in, obviously. And one will be in relation to the question of migration and the debate around movement of people, possibly in relation to the youth experience scheme, etc., but also in relation to human rights. So fundamentally, the Reform UK will lead the charge on trying to get the UK out of the European Convention on Human Rights, therefore the Council of Europe, and it will therefore be back to the EU to decide how important is compliance with human rights for its...
Are the Conservatives not also committed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no one's really talking about them as potential government partner. But yeah, absolutely. So it's a very real challenge and threat. Yeah.
There's a gentleman here in the second. Just here, if you just put up your hand.
Hi, Ragnar Weiland from the University of Malta. I wanted to bring in the global south, a substantial part of the world. So we talk about Europe and the world, and maybe this is something we might want to address. And I was wondering, isn't Ireland and an Irish presidency in a uniquely well positioned to engage with the global south, given that it's a country that has a history of being on the receiving end of colonial violence and exploitation on the one hand, but also that it is traditionally quite pro-Palestinian. And if there's one thing that really galvanizes public opinion and also elites, political elites in parts of the global south, then it's this perceived or actual double standards in how the EU, the West, reacted to Russia's war on Ukraine, and on the one hand, and to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So my question is, do you think that an Irish presidency would be in a position to engage, re-engage, and maybe rebuild trust that has been lost recently?
Barry, I think that's for you.
So Germany losing the Security Council vote was a real shock for them, and it underlined how its currency has been sort of debased as a result of the position it has adopted. So I think that's correct, and that Ireland has a lot of credibility. In early discussions around the priorities of the presidency, the government spoke to us as MEPs and said, look, we want to really emphasize humanitarian access to Gaza. And we as MEPs said, well, hang on a second, you could have been talking about that 5 years ago. So they took it on board, and they are now talking about, Palestinian statehood as part of their presidency priorities, and making sure that that's on the table. But as far as I'm concerned, the main issue here is trade. And if we could put some pressure on this Israeli government or the next one in relation to trade, it might have the desired effect. So, but when we talk about values as a priority of the Irish presidency of the EU, we'll see what that actually amounts to. When it comes to, as I said to you, what I am concerned about is that 200 billion euro global Europe. Is the Irish government going to be in a position as the presidency to defend that? But bearing in mind, you are an honest broker when you're in the chair, you're trying to drive agreements. So, but it is an opportunity, and I believe Ireland has huge credibility. When the European Council on Foreign Relations does a survey of each of the member states, it's the one area where Ireland has a huge amount of credibility, authenticity, and good, deep policy frameworks around it. So,
John.
Thanks, John O'Brien, Brookings University. It's the question you raised, Dan, about the FT report about the potential revamping and downgrading of the External Action Service. It seems to many of us this might be a very retrograde move, and that Kaja Kallas and her colleagues are being blamed for failures actually attributable properly to the European Council and elsewhere. So I wonder how you see this developing. Will the EEAS be downgraded, and what are the consequences?
Ilke, you might feel that one.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Actually, this idea was already around a bit, and the French especially, they were working on this dossier. It's funny, the French was the leading member state creating the External Action Service. Now they are the one that are discussing its use. I think the situation is not as dramatic as the FT reports, but there is a question actually in if the External Action Service is efficient in providing the European Union with a common foreign and security policy. This is the question, and I think the question is fair. The institutional question is fair. But then, for example, my personal fear out of this process is that there's already a tendency for flexibility, and there's already a tendency for intergovernmentalism in this policy area, which is understandable because this is, in any case, this competence. But my fear is the following. Right now, security is not just the traditional security as we know. All the instruments of trade, economy, critical raw materials, energy security, you name it, are part of the broader security agenda. So there is a logic to it that some parts of this is going to the Commission. It's like Commission having a more holistic approach to economic security and security as such. But I'm not so sure if this rethinking will end up creating a more powerful portfolio so that we can use trade and also the other instruments of economic security better. Is it the aim? Or is it going to be, again, going everything to the council and then becoming a more intergovernmental, where it is, unfortunately, especially in some very important dossiers, what the Israel examples, I think, is a very pertinent example. The approach is still dominated by some of the big member states and not necessarily looked for a common position that would benefit the EU as a whole. So, long story short, I think the intention is good. There should be a conversation about 15 years after creation. Is this institution serving to the aim? But then what will be the next step is the really important question. And if the next step is going to help us get to a better place.
Tom, from your perspective in Washington, does the External Action Service make much of a difference? Has it changed things very much from your perspective? Do the Americans take it seriously?
I think the increased role of the Commission has made a difference. I think van der Leyen has made a difference. I think the External Action Service has helped, but I think it depends a little bit on which issue. I think the main thing is, can there be someone who can, speak with some authority and actually mobilize some effort? And I think you've seen that particularly on, China policy by the Commission, which I think has helped. I think overall, on Russia, Ukraine, I think Callas has probably had a, positive impact over the last, couple of years. But I think previously, I think it was a little bit of a mixed bag. And I think Europe sort of struggled to have sort of a core sort of, diplomatic sort of input into that war.
Really interesting. Barry, you wanted to...
Yeah, just a quick sidebar, John, was that the Financial Times reported it as a proposal to downgrade the EAS. Reuters reported it as a proposal to upgrade the EAS.
Yes, exactly.
So there were three options in the paper. So it really depends on the way it's presented.
Okay, that's a really good point as well. Bridget.
A question for Barry on Organish.
Oh, God.
So we have an Russian oligarch-owned facility on the island. It's exporting intensively to St. Petersburg. We see the ships coming in and out. Is that an embarrassment for a country that says values lead its presidency? Question one. And question two, if it is proven beyond any doubt that this material goes into war material for the Russian attacks on Ukraine, should it and will it be sanctioned?
Yes to the second part, obviously. There's no question about it. If it's they deny that, but if it is part of the military supply chain that is attacking Ukraine. I was in Ukraine in November. We went over to Kharkiv with an anti-mining NGO doing extraordinary work. So I have absolutely no doubt, and I've made a statement about that, and that's fine. So the first point then, is it embarrassing? Well, Ireland isn't the biggest exporter to Russia, not by a long shot. There's lots of other countries, Germany's number one, then the Italians, the French, the Dutch, who are telling us what the right thing to do is here, export a lot more. Now, it may not be, for me, like there are certain categories of goods that are exempted for good reason, maybe. But we also have to, the question that was asked about double standards does bother me a little bit. A lot of countries kind of lecturing Ireland about how we should be complying with the international sanctions. But these are countries who don't even agree with international sanctions that would give effect to international law from the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice. So I'd be slow to take lectures about it or feel in any way embarrassed about it. But 100% agree with you. If this is shown to be part and parcel of the Russian military supply chain, then look, there is an investigation going on, and the correct response would be to give them an opportunity, short, limited opportunity, to find alternative markets for their product.
Just put my economist hat on. Like, it's really important what the export is. So if all our exports to Russia were whiskey, that is not good for the war effort. And what people often forget is that money that comes out of Russia to pay for imports actually weakens the Russian economy. So
more alumina.
Blocking everything doesn't actually make sense. You can weaken Russia by selling to it, but if you sell something that goes into its war effort, that's a different thing. By the way, 99% of EU alumina comes from this country.
Thanks very much. I'm Secretary General of Tabsajin Plus. I have a question for Tom. Tom, if we have a democratic president next in the United States, will the United States really stop blocking any move towards European autonomy? in terms of the industry and continue pressuring each time we say we should buy not totally European, but more European. And I have a question for Barry. What is your view on the global gateway as a way to square the circle between ODA, between geopolitics and our core interests? And finally, if I may say so, a very short remark, the EAS is a vastly overblown question. It's not a very important thing. It's a service. So, but I could elaborate.
Okay. Tom, did you get that question?
Yeah, I did on European autonomy. So I hope and think it might change. There's generally been a push here to ensure that, U.S. defense companies are, treated fairly, but that really means sort of that Europe sort of buys from them, and a hesitancy about Europe developing its own defense industrial base that would replace the US one in any way. I think the problem with that is sort of twofold. One, that there is a question about whether or not that could be weaponized in the future, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate concern that Europe has, and that it needs its own defense industrial base. I also think that there's, because of the dire nature of the world, that actually on something like air defense interceptors, there's more than enough demand for whatever can be produced, right? So basically, everyone should be trying to build more of that sort of defensive, weaponry, because we've just seen this used at an extraordinary scale, both in Ukraine, and in the Middle East, and we've run sort of short on Patriots and other types of air defense interceptors. So I think that's still an open question. I think whether or not a future Democratic administration would shift. To its credit, the Trump administration has shifted a bit on that. They've been a little less hung up on sort of the Buy American piece in terms of defense goods, and I think that's in part because they're quite short of them.
Okay, and I misspoke. 99% of all EU exports of alumina to Russia come from Ireland. Eurostat data. Barry.
Right. So on Global Gateway, it is presented initially as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. I criticize it immediately as old wine in new bottles, because for a long time we've been trying to leverage private sector investment for development, for sustainable development. That was at the core of the SDGs in 2015, from billions to trillions, so there wasn't anything new. But nobody knows what it is. Absolutely nobody knows what it is. Very kindly, Barry allowed me to make a presentation here in the IIEA on Global Gateway. And so that was probably the first proper discussion we've had in Global Gateway in this country, but we're probably the first EU member state to even talk about it. But the problem is that it is trying to address so many different issues using development money. So when we got to the end of the India trade agreement, and they were holding out on CBAM and its effect on them, we provided them with €500 million from our development funding budget as a sweetener to get the thing over the line. We did the same on Mercosur. So we're using these as sweeteners from the development budget for poverty eradication for very wealthy, reasonably wealthy countries in order to give effect to trade policy. So, it doesn't know what it is. We've had 2 board meetings since 2021. I'm the chairman of the development committee, so I'm supposed to be on the board of governance of it. We've had 2 board meetings since 2021. So there's governance problems, there's transparency problems, there's definitional problems. It's a lot of problems.
This reminds me, when the Belt and Road was introduced, I was in China and I asked everyone, what it does it mean? Nobody knew. Same thing.
Yeah, nobody knows in Europe what the Global Gateway.
I think I'm on time. Is it working?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. I'm from the Technical Institute for Europäische Politik, and I think I'm going to tie in a bit also with the Global Gateway question, but more on a broader scale, because I wanted to come back on the tensions between the values and interests. And Ilke, I was a bit triggered by what you said, because I know what you mean by, saying that the European Union needs to adapt its tools and its instruments, but I'm not sure whether it's so easy that it's only about security and prosperity, because I think also in the end, autocracies might also provide security and prosperity. So for me, it would be important to also define prosperity along liberal values. So you cannot take the values out of that equation, from my perspective. So another approach, what is usually also then referred to, is this, the policy is values-based but interest-driven. So this principled pragmatism approach. So would that be something that could help squaring the circle? Maybe a question to Ilke and also Barry. Both.
Ilke.
Thank you. Actually, I said as the next sentence, democracy is part of European prosperity to avoid this clash. But let me also explain this a bit further, because I personally think the European Union already includes democracy and rule of law, because rule of law is a very important component. Now, without the rule of law, the single market wouldn't work, the businesses wouldn't work, etc., etc. So this as a definition of its prosperity. So this is in the European context with the agreements and the rules. It is already inherently integrated in the conceptualization. So for me, there is no question there. The area that I have more questions than answers is in its relationship with the rest of the world. For example, India. With India, we signed the mother of all deals. The entire commission went to India. Is India's democratic credentials high enough? Is the governing party treating its citizens as in par with European democracies? No. Very clear no. Are we talking about it? No. Should we talk about it? That's the question. But then, for example, there are other countries where the relationships get tricky. China is clearly the prime example, but the lack of democracy is not the main problem. No? The economy is also the main problem there. But do we talk about the credentials there? Yes. In the case of Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is very clear now how many times we have said Russian invasion of Ukraine in all the meetings we have attended, and how many people that we know that are scared to say what is happening in Gaza with its name. What has happened, I'm really sorry, but the United States and Israel's attack on Iran, and again, the question on the legality of that. Iran is evil. I'm not going to defend that. But the question, what I was mentioning in that part is that the EU uses this selectively, and then it creates so much frustration when it comes to its relationships in the world. The Global South question was asked. I was lucky enough to visit most of the countries that we mentioned as the Global South in the last 3 years. And one of the core comments always is the double standards and how the EU is approaching the Ukraine question and the Gaza question separately. And this is really detrimental at the end of the day. So you cannot have an EU partnership agenda without being firm in your criteria. So what I recommend from my researcher point of view is that if we position the policy based on the citizens' prosperity and security, while the prosperity at home, including democracy and rule of law, while having not necessarily an entirely focus on this in the partnership agenda, which is the case anyway, getting critical raw materials from another country, very detrimental to their environmental standards. Do we still need them? Yes. I think being rather firm in the definition and being rather focused on the prosperity and security, and then the provision of public goods in the rest of the world, I think that would be a better framing of the EU in the world.
Katy, did you want to come up?
Yes, just very briefly, and I think what you said is fantastic. But just to emphasise the point that the Irish Presidency is action and delivery, and just to say values are actionable. And principled pragmatism gives the risk of minimizing, sort of saying, well, yes, but to such an extent. And in actual fact, what is it that we really need to value and enact but these values? So human dignity actually is actionable. Democracy is actionable. Yeah. They're not just mere principles. They actually stand for something. And the reason I was talking about Northern Ireland is to sort of just to highlight the fact that actually all of us can have we know what it's like to have these values eroded. The evidence is all around us across Europe and in our neighbouring countries. So just to really emphasise that point, that our interests are in our values, if you see what I mean.
Barry, I know you can be brilliant and brief. We've run over time.
Well, I'll just give an example of the returns legislation that we're voting on in the Parliament next week. And we're creating these hubs so we were asking them, where are these hubs going to be? And the only name that we've heard is Uzbekistan, which ranks 90th in the world in terms of democracy. But we're prepared to send people, women and children, and unaccompanied minors that have no connection to these countries. And like when the rubber hits the road, it's the conceptual framing of it is easier than the practical implementation.
So everyone believes in Rwanda now.
So I had a question for Katy, which you kind of actually already addressed, or probably at time. So
good. Yeah, we've run over. Listen, I'd really like to thank the panel for the contribution of the discussion, yourselves, the questions, and your attention. And with that, can we just thank the panel?